Okay, so I just wanted to make a quick video about kind of arguments for and against Quakelive being like the best FPS, AFPS, I guess. Um, so kind of just some intro thoughts I had. So overall, Quakelive is an AFPS that plays at a pace that's fast enough to be interesting, but slow enough to allow for the deep understanding, prediction, and calculation. Um, from this game was born the quote of 5 steps ahead of Rafa, because it comes from like the gameplay and the game style that that Quake Live encourages. Um, Quake Live is kind of for the player who enjoys formulating a detailed plan quickly and then executing on that in like a positional chess-like manner, rather than frantic responses to opponents' actions. Um, in Quake Live, items and stack are the most important for determining who's in control. Some other things, Quake Live has player-run servers to ensure the game can never truly die. The workshop allows for some uh, minimal content changes and more experiences in the future, as new maps and stuff. The game's design is chosen how to feel how the game should play, instead of the kind of modern client-side netcode techniques that are pretty typical in FPS games nowadays. Um, and then while Quake Live gives the same tools to every player is able to craft their own recognizable style using the tools available to them. And I want to dive into some pros and cons I see with Quake Live in as being the best AFPS. I'll break it down into 5 aspects. You got game, movement, weapons, maps and game modes, um, and then game itself. Two, three. Oh, did I say gameplay? Yeah. Anyway, going into movement. So movement is important to all AFPS games. It's uh, Other AFPS games typically have faster movement in general, but Quake Live chooses a slower, more predictable, calculatable movement, with just a little bit more speed than something like Quake 3. Um, the skill ceiling of the movement is actually a bit lower than a lot of other AFPS games, making it less of a deciding factor in like the winner of a game. Um, so, VQL movement is quicker than VQ3, just in general with the strafe jumping and the stairs going up. And it's not a differentiating factor. It is a little bit, but not totally in who's going to win games. So you can focus on kind of more other skills. You can really predict how long it's going to take for your opponents to get to other parts of the map, uh, in a way they don't typically surprise you. And I think some things against the movement of Quake Live, due to like the limitations of movement, it can become pretty hide and seek. You effectively have speed limits around the map whenever you get to a hard turn, and so it becomes a little bit too predictable. Um, and you can't really force yourself on the opponent when they have a large stack, or sorry, when you have a large stack and they don't. You can't really force yourself on them because rocket jumping towards your opponent, it gives them the first shot, since you have to reload and everything. Um, Added into that, switching weapons takes some time, so you can't switch to the correct weapon after rocket jumping towards them. Uh, Strafing straight towards an opponent is like also easy to defend against, uh, since it's typically, it's like pretty much a straight line when you're strafe jumping towards someone. And then, yeah, like I said before, these winding corridors really enforce the speed limit around the map. So talking about weapons, weapons, what's cool about them is they're not overpowered, so that like depending on position and the skill of the user, the weapon can feel either completely useless, or like completely broken, depending on who's using them. So, for example, if you have someone who's good with plasma, using plasma in this corridor on land, or not even on land, but on decent ping, you just can't push through this. It feels broken. It's like, well, now I can't get through here. And that's kind of the positional chess-like play, um, coming into it with like the plasma. Plasma spawns here. This border is completely blocked off by plasma. There's nothing you can do. It's too good. But and so every gun kind of has its use like that. And that's what's nice about Quakelive is every gun does actually have a use. That's not typical in AFPS. A lot of guns are pretty worthless. Dodging and faking opponents out is useful. The guns aren't so overpowered that you just can't dodge them. And due to not having client-side netcode, dodging is actually a factor. And then the weapon switch does punish kind of unthoughtful weapon selection, and you can't really just hold out with LG or rail due to the sound it makes. So it's a little bit more nuanced with weapon selection. And then kind of against the weapons is the switch kind of slows the game, like I said before with the rocket jump. So after shooting a rocket, you need to switch to something else. That gives over a second of just time to be hit by your opponent, which slows the game down. And the combos you're able to pull off get a little bit more predictable and uninteresting. There's maybe get like a rocket to rail combo, but you don't have much else. LG to rail when they get out of range, stuff like that. And then going into maps and game modes, I think this is where Quakelive does pretty well. There's a great amount of maps for all the game modes and players who play all of them. You got old maps, you got new maps, so that's all great. I think you have the best version of CTF in AFPS in Quakelive. Everyone has the same movement. The movement's like predictable enough to know what's possible, but you got 4 players on the map, all that kind of stuff. It's good. There's many game modes, so you can kind of take your pick. One thing is, due to the player-run servers, a lot of servers aren't going to have any custom maps. So even though there are like, the base game has a lot of maps to it, but the custom maps are not going to be available on every server, and there's no centralized kind of authority telling each server which custom maps they should have on them. Players have to figure that out for themselves. Going into the gameplay, so arguments for everyone's even footing, everyone has the same ability, and it's the mental game that kind of separates who's going to win. Execution and movement ability are less of a factor than other AFPS. And then due to the pace and regularity of the game, it becomes super calculatable, like going into how far you can calculate due to chess, like akin to chess. So you can understand what your opponent's done in the last 25, 35 seconds and set up plans that you can execute on for a minute or two into the future, which is much longer and further into the game than you think typically in a lot of other AFPS. You have stackable armors, so you can really control the whole map if you want to. If you want to make that a priority, you can stack up on every armor and kind of choke out your opponent, which tiered armors, that's not really possible unless you're taking a lot of damage. And then the Mega and Armor offset of 10 seconds allows like blocking down the map for some time if you're good. Which kind of gets to this cat and mouse kind of play style. But it's not simple enough to just cycle every 30 seconds, for example. And then against the gameplay, I think the biggest factor is the railgun is just too much of a deciding factor in the game. Whether it's like the entry damage, hitting like a rail or an exit rail, being like the tide that switches the balance of stacks into what players control, or taking a good rail duel. It's decides most fights, most games. It just comes down to how the railgun works. And then kind of the rat style's a bit inevitable. Getting back into the game also relies on the railgun quite a bit. But when the in-control player is behind on frags, the game gets really ratty and hide-and-seek like, usually if it's played correctly. That can get kind of boring, just chasing opponents down in combination with like how the movement's slow and predictable and the corridors have speed limits and all that stuff. It's a bit of a frustrating playstyle to be the player in control but down on frags, because you can't really force your opponent. You can't trade that stack and control for frags, for points on the board. You just have to make them screw up. Also, running out the clock is the usual anticlimactic end of the game, which isn't super satisfying a lot of the time. The Also the strength of the control and the ability for the player in the lead to rat can cause like 10-minute duels to be a little bit too short feeling to make a meaningful comeback. In the first 5 minutes, if you have good control and play well, you can get enough frags where you rat out with like the lead, and you having the lead is more of a beneficial factor than control in being able to play the rat game a lot of times. And then just talking about the game itself, the game runs well on old hardware, so that's nice. You get 250 FPS even with not that great of hardware. The servers are handled by the community. Like I said before, the game's never going to die fully. The workshop allows for creation of new content, which is nice. So the game potentially is not going to be stale if people want to keep making content. Finally made that jump. Nice. All right. And then another thing, it's a major thing, which is nice, is your opponent's network connection mostly doesn't affect how your game feels. In other words, like being communism, where the client-side netcode isn't what's believed. The server is more of the arbiter of what actually happens. And then kind of against it is, on the other side of that is you can't play on high pings. 60 plus ping feels bad. Your best experience is going to be on less than 20 milliseconds. And so you don't get cross-continent play, except for in some niche circumstances. Also, the game code's not open source, so modifications are limited. And then the game menus are a bit buggy. And kind of like navigation experience of the menus is not ideal. At least the game's on Steam though. So, kind of in conclusion, Quakelive is a bit of a slower pace, calculated AFPS experience. At the highest level, it's a battle of the players becomes more of a mental battle than a reaction execution competition. And the speed is slow enough to allow for this engaging spectator experience with commentary, even for those who are unfamiliar with the game itself. Personally, I first watched Quakelive, TDM and QuakeCons and stuff before I ended up playing the game, and so that was able to get me into the game, where just as a general gamer, I understood enough of what was going on, realizing the pickups and stuff. The game is slow enough the commentators can make interesting commentary to explain a little bit of what the players are actually doing, which is a little bit harder in more fast-paced AFPS games. But yeah, cool. Hopefully this video turns out well.